The galaxy watched in horror as humans marched out of the assembly. I was already moving when the Archon called my name. My boots were loud on the polished floor of the Grand Assembly Hall. Every step echoed like a crack through the silence that had fallen over the chamber the moment I stood up from the observer's gallery. I did not look back. I did not slow down. I could feel 4,000 years of galactic civilization staring at the back of my head, and I kept walking, because that was the only thing left to do, and I had waited a very long time to do it. My name is Era Vasquez. I am 39 years old. I grew up in Seville, in the south of Spain, on a planet called Earth, and I have spent the last 11 years of my life in a hall, built inside a hollowed asteroid, sitting in a gallery above the floor where the real decisions were made, representing a species that the galaxy had collectively decided did not yet qualify as real. I am the senior human delegate to the Galactic Concordat. The title had meant almost nothing for 3 decades. In the space of the last 60 seconds, it had come to mean everything. I was not angry when I walked out. I want to say that clearly because it matters, and because it is the thing people get wrong most consistently when they reconstruct this moment afterward. They imagine it as a boiling point, a moment of rage escaping containment, a human losing control in a formal session and walking out on impulse. That is not what happened. I was calm. I was so calm it almost surprised me, as though a part of me had expected the moment to feel more turbulent than it did. But I had rehearsed this for 7 years. I had thought about it on early mornings in my quarters on the assembly hub, in the long waiting periods between sessions when I sat alone and asked myself how much longer, and always arrived at the same answer. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Today it was now. Behind me, 11 other human delegates were on their feet. I had not given a signal. We had not rehearsed a formation. We had simply all arrived at the same place at the same time, the way it happens between people who have been carrying the same thought for a very long while and are finally putting it down. The session had been called to vote on motion 7441. The Archon had introduced it 3 weeks earlier, with the kind of careful bureaucratic language that makes genuine harm feel like routine administration. The motion proposed reclassifying the human solar system as a protected primitive reserve under Concordat Charter Article 88. Framed as a conservation measure, in practice, it meant that Earth, Mars, our outer colonies, every human installation within our home system would fall under Concordat stewardship. We would not be citizens of the galaxy, still working toward full membership, still developing in the direction the Concordat approved of. We would be an exhibit, a protected population in a managed environment, supervised by beings who had decided, without consulting us, that this was what was best for us. The motion had 47 co-sponsors. Not one of them had communicated with a human delegate before filing it. Not a message, not a preliminary notice, not a courtesy inquiry to establish whether we had been informed. We found it in the morning session agenda 3 weeks ago, listed between a Vrethali infrastructure funding proposal and a routine communications protocol update, as though it were comparable in significance to either. I had requested the floor twice in the preceding week. The first time, I was cut off at 41 seconds because I had exceeded the allowable commentary window for observer status delegates. The second time, I was granted the full 60 seconds, and I used every one of them, and sat down and watched the chamber move immediately to the next item on the agenda, as though I had not spoken at all. The Archon had not acknowledged my remarks. No delegate had responded to them. They had heard a human speaking, and processed it the way you process background noise in a room where the main conversation is happening elsewhere. That was the last time I sat down in that room. The hall itself was extraordinary. I have always believed in being honest about this because reducing the Concordat to its injustices without acknowledging what it built is its own kind of dishonesty, and I have tried throughout my career to be accurate, even about things that are inconvenient. The Grand Assembly Hall was constructed inside a hollowed asteroid towed to the gravitational center of 7 inhabited systems over 2,000 years ago. A feat of engineering so considerable that the mathematics alone had occupied 500 specialists for a decade. The ceiling was transparent, and above it the stars burned with the permanent, indifferent precision they have always had. The chamber rose in sweeping tiers, each designed for a different species with different atmospheric requirements, gravity preferences, and light spectra, so that thousands of beings could occupy the same structure without sharing the same air. It was a genuine monument to the idea that difference could be made habitable. It was also, as I had come to understand, a monument to the idea that some differences were more habitable than others, and that the beings who designed the architecture decided which was which. There were 4,312 species represented in the Concordat. Humanity had been an observer for 31 years. We had applied for full membership 11 times. We had been declined 11 times, always with language about developmental readiness, always with a procedural courtesy that made refusal feel like encouragement, always without any specific definition of what developmental readiness meant, or what evidence of it would look like if we produced it. I had asked that question directly, in formal sessions, twice. The answers I received were so thoroughly circular, they would have been impressive as rhetorical performances if they had not been so clearly designed to say nothing. On the morning of the vote, I sat in the observers' gallery and listened to 8 species deliver prepared remarks in support of Motion 7441. The Vrethali representative, a tall being with 8 arms folded across a chest that gleamed like polished copper, described humanity with the kind of gentle, practiced condescension you use for beings you have already decided cannot understand your reasoning. He said humans showed promising developmental signs. He said structured oversight would provide a stable environment for continued growth. He said the Concordat had a long tradition of responsible stewardship toward civilizations in earlier developmental stages. He said all of this while looking at the gallery tier directly above us, not at us, as though we were not present, as though discussing the future of 8 billion human beings while the human delegates sat 15 meters away was simply the normal way these things were done. In 4,000 years of recorded Concordat history, no species had been discussed in their own presence as though they were not there. We were the first. When the Archon opened the floor for final comments before the vote, I stood. His 4 eyes moved toward me. 2 registered mild surprise. 2 registered something I had learned to identify as amused tolerance, the expression of someone watching a familiar performance that will conclude predictably. He granted me the floor with a small gesture that communicated, without words, that he was being generous with his time. I walked down from the observers' gallery to the main floor. This was not standard procedure. Observers did not access the main floor during formal sessions. Murmuring began in a dozen languages as I descended. A procedural officer in formal Concordat robes moved to intercept me. I looked at him with complete steadiness, and something in my expression caused him to stop and reconsider his next action. I walked to the center of the floor. I stood in the precise geometric center of the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Concordat, a position reserved for full member delegates during formal address, and I looked up at the tiers. I took my time with it. I looked at the Vrethali delegate. I looked at the Archon. I looked at the 3,000 diplomatic feeds broadcasting this session across the galaxy in real time. I found every camera I could identify and I looked directly into it, because I wanted every watching eye in the galaxy to see a human face clearly, at least once, before what came next. Not performing anything, just being visible in a place where we had spent 31 years being treated as invisible. I said, "We withdraw." 2 words. In Standard Galactic first, then in English, then in Standard Galactic once more, so there was no possible misunderstanding. Then I turned and walked toward the great doors at the back of the hall. Behind me, the sound of chairs moving, 11 sets of boots on the polished floor, my delegation rising without instruction, without a signal, because we all knew. We had all known for a long time. I did not look back to verify they were there. I knew they were. Some things you know without checking. The hall was silent in a way I had never heard it. In 4,000 years of Concordat history, no member, observer, or affiliate had ever walked out of a session. The chamber had survived wars and extinctions, and the political collapse of entire empires. Its proceedings had continued through all of it. There was no protocol for this, no procedure, no historical precedent, no filing category. The most thoroughly organized governing body in the known galaxy had encountered something it had not thought to prepare for, because it had never imagined that the beings in the observer gallery would be the ones to require it. I was halfway to the doors when the Archon called my name. Not my title, not the human observer. My name, Era Vasquez. It was the first time in 11 years that the Archon of the Galactic Concordat had addressed me as though I were an individual. I did not stop. The great doors were 12 meters high, made of a crystalline composite that refracted starlight into spectral colors I had never had names for. A small Pelari door attendant in formal robes stood at the base of them, staring at me with 4 wide eyes, and no clear sense of what the correct response was to what was currently happening. I nodded to him. He stepped aside. The doors opened. The corridor light on the other side was ordinary and functional and white, and I was deeply glad to see it. As I crossed the threshold, I heard the Archon speak one last sentence to the chamber. The closing doors carried fragments of it back to me, not enough for a complete translation, but enough for tone. I had spent 11 years developing the ability to read tone across every species barrier I encountered, and what I heard in his voice in that moment was something I had never heard from him before in all of that time. It was not anger. It was not outrage. It was not the offended dignity of an authority that has been challenged and expects to correct the situation shortly. It was uncertainty. I kept walking. 30 minutes before the first set of contingency protocols would activate across human space, an enormous amount left to do. Standing in a corridor feeling the weight of the moment was something I could afford for perhaps 10 seconds. I used 8 of them. Then I walked faster. The doors closed behind all 12 of us, and the silence they sealed on the other side was the most significant sound I had ever been part of. The transit shuttle from the assembly hub to Human Diplomatic Dock 7 took 9 minutes. I used every one of them. I sat in the rear of the shuttle with Delegate Owen Price on my left and Delegate Kara Nolan on my right. The 9 other delegates occupied the forward seats, and every one of them was already working their communications device before the docking clamps finished releasing. There was no conversation. We had been a team for 4 years, and we did not need words to coordinate. We had done all the talking earlier, over months of planning and late evening sessions and careful rehearsals that we had described, in all official documentation, as communications protocol drills. Owen Price was 44, from Cardiff, with a background in trade arbitration that had given him an encyclopedic understanding of how the Concordat's commercial frameworks functioned, and, more usefully, exactly where they were exploitable. He had joined the diplomatic corps after 12 years of watching the Concordat override human shipping agreements without notification, canceling contracts that human companies had negotiated directly with species they had built real relationships with, substituting Concordat standard terms that benefited the preferred parties of the Concordat's most powerful members. He had tried to work within the system for 12 years. He had arrived at the diplomatic corps with very precise knowledge of why that approach had a ceiling. He was already composing the formal withdrawal declaration, fingers moving with the quiet efficiency of someone completing a task they have rehearsed past the point of conscious effort. His expression was calm and focused. Owen was always calm, not because nothing affected him, but because he had decided very deliberately that calm was a tool, and tools should be used properly and at the right time. Kara Nolan was 36, from Edinburgh, and she was the reason the walkout had happened today, rather than 3 months earlier or 6 months later. She had what I can only describe as a political sense of timing, the ability to perceive not just what was happening, but precisely when it was about to become something different. She had spent 2 years monitoring the Concordat's internal scheduling systems, watching the rhythms of session attendance and relay network audiences and political attention cycles, waiting for the specific moment when the conditions would align correctly. This session had been broadcast to more than 800 relay networks. The audience was the largest for any Concordat proceeding in 60 years. We had wanted witnesses. She had found them. Through the shuttle window, I watched the assembly hub recede. The distance softened it into something that looked like what it had been designed to look like, a symbol of unity, of civilization, of the idea that different species could govern themselves together across all the differences that separated them. The idea was genuine. The execution had drifted very far from it, over 4,000 years of accumulated institutional preferences and the natural gravity of any old system toward the comfort of those who had been inside it longest. My device vibrated. The message from Director Colin Webb at Frontier Command was short and used the language we had agreed on. Confirmed. All embassies are executing. Sol network is live. Standing by. I sent back 2 words. Proceed as planned. What the Concordat did not yet understand and was about to begin discovering in pieces, was that the walkout was not the action. It was the announcement of the action, which had been happening for nearly a decade in systems the Concordat had classified as commercially uninteresting and filed away without a second visit. Let me explain this clearly. When humanity first arrived at the assembly hub as observers 31 years ago, we were given a gallery seat, a thick document of conduct guidelines, and the implicit understanding that we would wait, developing appropriately, until the Concordat decided we were ready for something better. We watched. We studied. We learned the procedures and the political structures and the relationships between species and the vast web of agreements that held the Concordat together. We also noticed something I do not believe the Concordat intended us to notice. The Concordat was old, very old, and in the way that very old institutions become, it was fundamentally self-referential. It had been designed by a group of species for a group of species, and it had expanded since its founding, without fundamentally changing. Its members had extraordinary capacity for managing complexity inside their own established systems. They had almost no practice with anything that operated outside those systems in ways they had not anticipated or authorized. Humanity, as an observer with no formal standing, was outside those systems by definition. We had no vote, no seat, no recognized role. We were, precisely because of this, essentially invisible to the Concordat's vast bureaucratic attention. The assumption was reasonable. If the assembly hall was the center of galactic power, then the gallery was the most important place an observer species could be, and their attention would be fixed on earning a better position within that structure. The assumption was wrong. We used the invisibility methodically. Over 31 years, under the cover of Concordat-approved survey and research designations, human vessels mapped and in many cases quietly developed resources across more than 200 star systems that the Concordat's own records classified as uninhabited and commercially uninteresting. The Concordat's survey data was in some cases 400 years old, compiled by automated probes that spent a few days in a system and moved on to something the algorithm preferred. We spent considerably longer. Over the 12 years preceding the walkout, human construction and settlement teams had established what we internally called the Shadow Network, active human presence in 140 systems, from unmanned relay and communication stations to fully inhabited colonies with populations in the hundreds of thousands, with medical facilities and schools, and the accumulated infrastructure of communities that intended to stay. None of this was hidden in the sense of being actively concealed. It was simply not announced. No Concordat charter provision required observer status civilizations to register territorial activity outside their home system. No one had ever thought to write that rule because no one had ever imagined it would need to exist. The Concordat had spent 31 years modeling humanity as a developing civilization confined to our solar system, slowly maturing, patiently waiting for inclusion. They had not considered the possibility that we had been building something else entirely. The shuttle docked at Bay 7. We moved to the Ardent without delay. Captain Nate Holloway met us at the inner airlock, 51 years old, with the broad-shouldered quiet of someone who has spent decades making fast decisions without visible urgency. 20 years with the human diplomatic fleet, which meant 20 years of escorting delegations to and from an assembly hub that treated them as background. He shook my hand without ceremony. "They are talking," he said. "Concordat channels." Coherent? Nothing coherent yet. Largely internal. Some of it elevated in intensity. Good. Elevated means surprised. Surprised means we are ahead of them. We went to the bridge. I stood at the primary communications console and pulled up the intercept feeds our signals team had been running for years through relay markers we had positioned in the hub vicinity, filed in Concordat systems as navigational calibration equipment, which they also were. The feeds were partial. Encrypted Concordat communications partially resolved through our relay array. Enough to build a picture. The picture was confusion. Deep, organized, procedurally parallelized confusion. The Concordat had response protocols for nearly every eventuality that had occurred in 4,000 years. Wars, ecological disasters, species extinctions, member civil conflicts, the sudden collapse of planetary governments. All of it documented. All of it assigned to designated procedures and designated officers. An observer civilization withdrawing from the assembly and simultaneously activating a galaxy-wide diplomatic transition had no designated procedure, because it had never been imagined. The most organized governing body in galactic history was running at speed inside a filing system that did not contain the folder it needed. We had perhaps 48 hours before that changed. Sir, Hannah OCA at the signal station, her voice carrying the characteristic steadiness of someone who has decided in advance that whatever happens next will be manageable. She was 28, and I had been trying to find ways to promote her for 2 years. Incoming contact. Concordat Enforcement Vessel, Vrthali Hegemony Registry. They are requesting we hold position for a navigation review. I looked at Holloway. He already had the tactical display up. The enforcement dreadnought was 300 meters of Vrthali military construction, positioned directly across our most efficient exit corridor. It had not been there 20 minutes ago. Someone on the Concordat side had recovered from the initial confusion fast enough to issue operational orders, which told me we had less than 48 hours before they found their full footing. Good to know precisely. Holloway opened a channel. Enforcement vessel, he said. This is the Ardent, diplomatic vessel, Earth Registry. We have noted your current position. We note also that we hold targeting solutions for 84 vessels currently in the assembly hub vicinity, including your vessel, prepared and active as of approximately 6 minutes ago. We are not initiating targeting action. We are noting these solutions as a matter of transparency, since you have expressed interest in navigational matters. We invite you to consider your next course adjustment carefully. The bridge was quiet. The ventilation ran. Hannah Osei watched her console with the focused composure of someone who has already decided to be calm regardless of outcome. The dreadnought held position, did not advance, did not respond. They are verifying, Holloway said quietly, meaning they were checking whether we were describing a real capability. We were. The targeting solutions were 3 months old, updated continuously, as part of standard defensive protocol, and accurate to acceptable margins for every vessel in the hub vicinity. We had not told anyone this previously. There had been no reason to. Now there was, and it was interesting to observe the Concordat suddenly paying the kind of attention to us that it had spent 31 years not paying. 3 minutes and 41 seconds passed. The bridge stayed quiet. I was aware of my own breathing, steady, even. Then the dreadnought moved, not toward us. 2 degrees of arc, sideways, opening the exit corridor by a margin that was small but completely unambiguous. They had run the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that opening the corridor was the correct decision. Holloway set a course. The Ardent began to move, steady through the dark. I went to the rear observation port and watched the assembly hub shrink behind us. Its lights were still beautiful at this distance. I watched them diminish without feeling what I might have expected to feel. Not triumph, which implies something finished. Not relief, not yet. Mostly a very clear awareness of everything that came next, and how limited the time was to do it. I thought about the memorial wall at Frontier Command. I had visited it twice, and intended to visit it again as soon as we arrived. 80,000 names. Engineers and pilots and builders and medical officers and communications specialists and administrators. People who had worked in conditions that were difficult and sometimes dangerous, and entirely without recognition, because the work they were doing could not be acknowledged without destroying the purpose of doing it. They had built the relay stations and the supply routes and the colony habitats and the communication networks. Some had not come home from that work. All of them had understood that what they were building might not see completion within their own lives, and had done it anyway. Humans build toward futures they may not inhabit. We have always done this. It is one of the things about us that no spacefaring species had ever quite accounted for when modeling what humanity might become. Hannah Osei added a live counter to my secondary console without being asked. The number of species that had sent direct diplomatic inquiries to human embassies, bypassing Concordat channels, treating us as something worth speaking to as equals, in the last 2 hours. 17, then 23, then 31. I watched it for a while. Then I turned back to the stars ahead of us and thought about everything left to do. There was a very great deal of it. I was not tired. Neither was anyone else on that ship. That was something, I thought, that the Concordat was going to have to eventually understand about us. We do not tire in the way they expected us to tire. We had been sitting in a gallery for 31 years, and some species would have been worn down by that. We had used it as time to build. The counter on my console updated again. 38, then 41. I went to my desk and started working. The Frontier Command Station occupied a position in a system the Concordat's 400-year-old survey data described as a Class 4 stellar environment of limited resource potential and no strategic value. The survey drone had spent 11 hours there before the algorithm directed it elsewhere. In the 4 centuries since that drone's brief visit, no Concordat vessel had returned to verify the assessment. We had been here for 12 years. The station was functional and deliberately unpretentious, assembled in standard construction modules that could be expanded or reconfigured without specialized crews, built to look like exactly the kind of logistical coordination hub that survey and research operations reasonably required. Nothing about its exterior or its interior communicated anything other than this is an ordinary installation doing ordinary work. The ceilings were low, the corridors were narrow, the lighting ran on an efficient yellow-white spectrum that made everyone look slightly tired. It had been designed by people who understood that the most important thing it could be, for a very long time, was easy to overlook. It was no longer necessary for it to be easy to overlook. That was one of the things that had changed in the last 14 days. Director Colin Webb was waiting in the docking bay when the Ardent locked in. He was 62, carrying the leanness of someone who treats meals as interruptions to work, with close-cropped white hair and dark eyes that moved constantly across every room he entered, taking quiet inventory of what was different from the last time he looked. He had been building the Shadow Network for 17 years, beginning with a declassified policy proposal and a small operational budget that had required creative interpretation of several Concordat charter provisions to access legally. The result was what I was about to see for the first time in its complete form. He shook my hand and said, 31 species have made direct contact in the last 6 hours. The count was at 44 now. 3 are current Concordat members seeking bilateral frameworks outside assembly arbitration channels. And 1, he said, pausing for effect even though Colin Webb was not the kind of person who paused for effect. 1 is Vrathali, a regional council from the hegemony's 4th inhabited moon. 60 years of underrepresentation in Concordat proceedings. They have been watching what we do very carefully. Get them on the priority schedule, I said. Immediately. We walked from the docking bay into the main operations center. The room was not large, but it was fully active, every station occupied, every display running current data, people moving between terminals with the focused energy of those executing a plan they have prepared for years and finally received authorization to begin. Not the frantic movement of people responding to unexpected crisis. The purposeful, almost quiet movement of people doing exactly what they had planned to do. The 2 states look nothing alike once you know what to look for, and I had spent enough of my career in both to tell them apart instantly. Along the far wall, the tactical display showed the disposition of vessels across what we had been calling the transition zone, the region between our furthest established positions and the nearest Concordat-aligned systems. The ships marked on that display were not the ones in any Concordat registry. They were ours, in their planned positions, doing exactly what 12 years of preparation had designed them to do. I looked at the display for a long moment. There was something very specific about seeing a plan made physical, laid out on a tactical screen in real positions with real vessels, after years of seeing it only as projections and proposals and classified documentation. Colin took me to the conference room at the back of the operations center, small enough for 4 people in comfortable proximity. There was coffee. I sat down and addressed it before anything else, because it had been a long morning. How long do we have before the hegemony fleet moves? I asked. Our intelligence estimates 48 to 72 hours before the High Council convenes an emergency session. Another 24 after that before a fleet response is authorized. Call it 4 days as the working estimate. And when they move, what do they send? A show of force at our zone boundary. Our assessment says they will not initiate engagement. They do not know enough about our actual capabilities to be confident in direct confrontation, and the hegemony is historically methodical about escalation. They will position assets as a political signal, a reminder of their scale, and a reminder that we are, as far as they know, much smaller. As far as they know, Colin said. I want the full deployment map, I said. Not the operational summary, the complete picture. He pulled it up on the room's display. I had seen sections of this in planning sessions and progress reviews over the years. Specific regions, specific operational phases, specific clusters of installations. I had never seen it all at once. Every installation and relay and vessel and colony mapped together in the full picture of what 12 years of work had built. I looked at it for a long time without speaking. What I was looking at was a civilization. Not a large one. Not yet, but unmistakably real. Human presence in 140 systems. Inhabited colonies with actual communities, not just outposts. Medical stations that had been running for years. Educational facilities. Supply networks connecting the installations to each other across the distances between them. Communication arrays spanning the entire structure so that a person on the most distant colony could reach anyone else in the network in hours rather than weeks. The bones of an independent galactic presence, built methodically in the spaces between Concordat attention, by people whose work had been deliberately kept out of the historical record for a very long time. I thought about the memorial wall 2 corridors away. The names there were not a statistic. They were 80,000 individual decisions, made by 80,000 individual people, to do difficult and dangerous and unrecognized work, toward a future they understood they might not personally see. Engineers who had built relay stations in deep space environments, where equipment failure was a routine rather than an exceptional occurrence. Pilots who had navigated systems without Concordat navigation support. Doctors who had staffed medical installations without the supply chains that Concordat-affiliated facilities took for granted. Colony administrators who had built civic structures from scratch in places that had never had them, for communities that understood their existence, could not be publicly acknowledged for years. Several thousand of them had not come home. The documentation on some of those situations was limited in ways I had learned not to push against, because the limitations existed for reasons that were legitimate, and which I respected. I looked at the deployment map and thought, every dot on this display is also a name on that wall. The two things are not separate documents. They are the same record. When the hegemony fleet arrives, what are our response options? I asked. Colin outlined 3. Option 1 was a mirror move. Match their fleet positioning. No engagement. A signal that we see what they are doing and are not retreating. Option 2 was dispersal. Spread our assets across the zone so there was no single concentration for them to face. Option 3 was what Captain Holloway had been calling the corridor play. Tell me the corridor play. We identify the 3 most strategically significant supply corridors the Verthali hegemony relies on to provision its outer colony systems. We place 1 vessel in each corridor. We do not block the corridor. We do not threaten any vessel using it. We simply occupy the space and communicate, factually, that these corridors now pass through territory that is no longer under Concordat jurisdiction, and that any vessel using them should be aware of this change in status. We note that we are available to discuss arrangements. We are not threatening to block them. No, we are noting that we are present. I thought about the dreadnought in the assembly hub vicinity, the way it had moved those 2 degrees after Holloway described the targeting solutions. Not because we had threatened action, because we had described a fact, calmly and with precision. Threats engage the emotional and political machinery of response, which is unpredictable and expensive for everyone. Facts engage the machinery of calculation, which is predictable and, in sufficiently capable adversaries, generally conservative. We wanted the hegemony calculating. Option 3, I said, implement it. Colin moved to do so without requiring the instruction twice, which was one of the many reasons I valued working with him. I finished my coffee and looked at the deployment map for another few minutes. Then I went to see the memorial wall. The corridor was quiet at this hour. 2 sections removed from the operations center, away from the activity, lit the same as every other corridor in the station. The names were small text on plain material, not mounted for display or drama, just names and dates and, in some cases, system designations. The locations where people had been when the records stopped. I walked the full length slowly, reading names I knew and names I did not, and I thought about the difference between preparing for something and having it arrive. For years, this wall had been a record of what the preparation had cost. Now, for the first time, the preparation was producing visible results. 44 species making direct contact. 3 Concordat members seeking alternative frameworks. The Vrithali fourth moon reaching out before we had even established formal communications. The cost was real. The result was becoming real. I stood at the end of the corridor for a moment. Then I went back to work. Lena Marsh was the communications specialist Colin had described as the best on station. She arrived at the conference room with a communications array under one arm and the focused expression of someone who had been expecting this particular task and had already started thinking through how to meet it. She was in her late 20s, with the precise hands of someone who works regularly with equipment where imprecision has consequences. "I need a channel to everywhere," I said. "Define everywhere." I liked that she asked. It was the right question. Every relay network we operate, every system with any human presence, every species that has made direct contact in the last 6 hours, and every Concordat-aligned world where we have an ambassador. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. 20 minutes. 15. She sat down and started without another word. I started drafting the message. What I was writing was not for the Concordat. They would receive it, but they were not the audience I was addressing. The audience was every civilization in the galaxy that had spent the last several hours watching the walkout footage on relay networks and trying to understand what they had seen and what it meant for them. I wanted to tell them directly, in clear language, without ceremony or drama, exactly what had happened and why. Not to persuade them of anything or alarm them or recruit them, just to speak plainly, as one civilization to the others, and let them evaluate what we had said on its own terms. Humanity had spent 31 years being discussed as though we were not present. The least I could do, now that we had the floor, was actually use it honestly. Lena had the channel ready in 13 minutes. I sent the message in 15. Then I set the device down and remained at the conference room table for a few minutes in the particular quiet that follows a thing that cannot be undone. Outside the station, somewhere in the systems we had quietly built a presence in over 12 years, 80,000 people's worth of work was now the foundation of something real. That felt like the most important thing that had happened today. Not the walkout, not the targeting solutions, not the dreadnought moving 2 degrees of arc. The foundation, that was the thing. I picked up the device and opened the next item on the schedule. There were many of them. The Concordat envoy arrived on the 14th day. His name was Advocate Cyril. He was Polari, which meant he was a member of the species that had been advising the Concordat on its most difficult negotiations for 4,000 years. The Polari were small and gray-skinned, with large, widely spaced eyes, and a cultivated reputation for finding workable ground between positions that appeared, to everyone else, to be irreconcilable. They were trusted across species lines, which in the Concordat was the most valuable thing a civilization could be. Sending Cyril was a signal. It meant the Concordat was taking us seriously in a way they had not been taking us seriously a month ago. A month is very little time for that to change completely. He came alone by the standards of Concordat diplomatic practice, which is to say he arrived on a single shuttle with 2 aides and no support staff, no protocol officers, no ceremony of any kind. He had sent his meeting request directly to me, not through formal channels, and the message he sent was precise and brief. He wished to talk, not to negotiate. He said these were different activities. That distinction was interesting enough that I agreed to meet him. We used a conference room on the Ardent. Owen Price sat beside me. Kara Nolan was in the communications room with an audio feed. I trusted both of them to tell me afterward what I had missed in the moment, because there is always something you miss when you are the one doing the talking, and the things you miss are often the most important things. Cyril was smaller than I expected. Most Polari I had encountered in Concordat contexts wore formal diplomatic robes that increased their apparent presence. Without the ceremony, Cyril was a slight figure who nonetheless occupied the room with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent 40 years being the most capable person in the most difficult conversations. His eyes were large and constantly attentive, and his hands moved in the small, continuous gestures that constitute, in Polari, a complete parallel language running beneath whatever the words were saying. He sat across from me and said, "In Standard Galactic, you surprised us." "I know. I do not mean the walkout. That was surprising, certainly. I mean the extent of what you have built. Our intelligence had identified approximately a third of it." He paused. The rest was a surprise of a different magnitude. His left hand made a gesture that translated as, I significantly underestimated this. I did not respond to that directly. I waited. "The High Council," he said, "has authorized me to offer the following terms. Full membership in the Concordat, effective immediately. A permanent seat on the High Council. Retroactive recognition of all human territorial activity within the zone your people have designated, including all 140 identified systems, and a buffer region extending beyond them, and a formal apology, entered into the official session record, for the conduct of proceedings at the assembly session in question." He delivered it without hesitation, the way you deliver something you have rehearsed past the point where the magnitude of it produces any visible discomfort. That kind of composure takes real discipline. Owen wrote something on his notepad without looking up. 7 years ago, this would have been everything. He was right. 7 years ago, those terms would have ended 31 years of frustration in an afternoon: full membership, a permanent High Council seat, recognition, and a formal apology in the official record. Every human delegate who had ever sat in the observer gallery would have considered it the fulfillment of everything they had spent their career working toward. But accepting those terms now, in this context, would mean accepting the Concordat's framework as the rightful structure of galactic civilization, stepping into it not as a civilization that had earned inclusion, but as one that had frightened the institution into offering it. The distinction is not subtle. Joining under these circumstances would make us one voice among thousands in a body whose structure had been designed around values and priorities that humanity had not participated in establishing, in an institution whose 4,000-year pattern was to incorporate new members and, gradually and without any deliberate malice, smooth them into alignment with the preferences of the most powerful existing members. Not through coercion, through institutional gravity. The largest objects in any system attract others toward their orbits, and eventually attraction becomes indistinguishable from containment. I had not spent 11 years in the observer gallery, and 12 years helping build the shadow network, to move into a more comfortable version of the same position. "Advocate Sorel," I said, "I am going to tell you what humanity intends to do next. I want you to take it to the High Council with the clear understanding that it comes without hostility toward the Concordat, or any of its member civilizations. I mean that genuinely." He nodded, once, with care. "Humanity declines membership in the Concordat." His hands went completely still. First time since he had sat down. "In its place," I said, "we propose the establishment of a new body. We are calling it the Terran Compact. It will be a diplomatic and trade organization open to any civilization, Concordat member or otherwise, that wishes to operate under frameworks outside Concordat arbitration. It will be hosted and initially funded by humanity. It will operate from a permanent station we are currently constructing in neutral space. Every member will be a full partner with full voting rights on every matter affecting their interests. There will be no observers. There will be no developmental classifications. No motion affecting any member civilization will reach a vote without that civilization present and represented in the chamber." Cyril was very still. "The Concordat is not in opposition to this," I said, and I meant it. "We are not declaring conflict with Concordat members. We are not moving against Concordat territory. We are not obstructing Concordat operations. We are establishing an alternative, an addition to the galactic order. Species that value what the Concordat provides will continue to have access to it. Species that want something different will now have that option." He was quiet for a considerable time. Owen shifted slightly beside me. I put my hand flat on the table and he settled. "Some silences need to resolve on their own. You understand," Sorel said finally, "that this permanently and irreversibly alters the structure of galactic governance." "Yes," I said, "that is the intention." Another pause, shorter. Then he said something I had not anticipated from a Concordat advocate of his caliber and experience. He said, "I have negotiated in the aftermath of wars, ecological disasters, 3 succession crises in member civilizations, and the formal dissolution of 2 species' entire political structures. In 41 years of this work, I have never sat across from anyone who declined what you just declined." I waited. "I am genuinely uncertain," he said, "whether I should be alarmed or relieved by this conversation." "Probably both," I said. "Most genuinely significant things earn both." He made the Polari gesture of real acknowledgement between 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other. I had seen it twice before in my career, both times at critical moments, and I received it as the specific kind of compliment it was. We spent the next hour working through practical detail, charter frameworks for the compact, transition protocols for civilizations wanting to maintain concordat standing, while also joining the new body, the complex question of how existing concordat arbitration rulings would interface with new compact agreements. We did not resolve any of it that afternoon. We built a thorough and specific list of the questions that needed resolving. In diplomacy, a well-built list of the right questions is real and significant progress. When Cyril left, Kara came in from the communications room and sat where he had been sitting, across from me. Her expression was the one she wore when the numbers she was tracking had significantly exceeded her projections. 26 species have applied for compact membership in the last 48 hours, she said. 26. 3 of them are current Concordat members, and one of those 3 is Polari. She let that land for a moment. Not the Concordat Polari delegation, the home government, the Polari collective itself. I sat with that. The Polari had been in the Concordat since its founding, 4,000 years ago. They had sent their finest negotiator to offer humanity a high council seat, and while he was in the room with me, the Polari home government had applied to join something humanity had announced 2 weeks ago. It was not a betrayal of Cyril. He had done his job with skill and genuine integrity, but it was a signal, unmistakably clear, that even within the Concordat's founding species, there were those who had spent a long time wanting something different, and had simply not had anywhere else to direct that want. Until now. Get the Polari Collective on a channel, I said, and scheduled direct conversations with every applicant in the last 48 hours. Their preferred format, their preferred timing, each one handled as a priority. That is 46 separate conversations, Kara said. Then we begin immediately. She was already moving when I finished the sentence. Outside the porthole, the Vrethali hegemony fleet held its position at the edge of our declared zone, 9 significant vessels, in a formation designed to communicate mass and readiness. They had been there for 3 days. They had not advanced. They were waiting for something to happen that would allow them to respond, rather than having to decide. We were not going to provide that. I picked up my device and opened the first call. From a small civilization called the Tessari, whose home system was on the far edge of Concordat-claimed territory, and who had been trying to renegotiate their trade framework with the Concordat for 11 years and getting nowhere. 11 years. I understood something about 11 years. I knew exactly what to say to them. The conversations continued for the next 16 hours. When I finally stopped to sleep, the application count had reached 38. By the time I woke, it was 43. The list of names on the memorial wall was 80,000 long. Every application was something those 80,000 people had built toward without knowing exactly what they were building toward. Every one of those applications was a piece of evidence that the infrastructure they had constructed in the dark had been worth constructing. I thought about them constantly. I hoped, in whatever way people persist after they are gone, that they could tell. The inaugural session of the Terran Compact opened on an ordinary Tuesday. I noted that deliberately in the official record when I wrote it up that evening. An ordinary Tuesday. The calendar was full of them. Vast numbers between the significant days, filling in the structure of time without demanding attention. Most days are ordinary until they are not, and they stop being ordinary not when they are happening but afterward, when the shape of what changed becomes visible in retrospect. I liked the ordinariness of this Tuesday. I thought the people who had built toward this moment, most of them in conditions that were anything but ordinary, deserved to have it land on a day that made the continuity of the work visible. Not a special occasion, just the next thing after all the other things. The Meridian was 6 months old. We had constructed it in the time that the Concordat's own capability assessments had suggested would be sufficient for planning the preliminary survey. It was not beautiful in the way the assembly hub was beautiful. It did not have transparent ceilings full of stars or crystalline walls that refracted light into colors without names or centuries of accumulated aesthetic intention layered into its design. It was new, and it looked new, and it smelled like fabricated air and fresh materials and the specific energy of spaces that have recently been filled with purposeful people for the first time. The main hall seated representatives of 200 species. It had been designed for expansion to 500. Every seat was a full member seat. There was no gallery, no raised platform for presiding authority, no architectural hierarchy that communicated through the geometry of the room who was more central and who was peripheral. The floor was level, the table was round, the seating radiated outward in concentric circles so that every delegate was equidistant from the center. I had thought very carefully about the geometry, because geometry is never neutral. Rooms communicate their values through their shapes, and this room was built to communicate the absence of rank. The compact had no permanent presiding officer. The chair of each session rotated alphabetically by species name. I had designed this provision specifically so that the first chair would not be a human. The first chair was a Quellan representative, and this was exactly right, because the point of what we had built was never to replace Concordat authority with human authority. It was to build something that did not organize itself around a center at all. Delegate Rivi of the Quellan brought the session to order. The Quellan communicated through modulated pressure waves, and Rivi's voice, processed through the translation systems we had spent 2 years and considerable resources building, arrived at every delegate's station in their own preferred language and format. Those translation systems had been funded from the same operational budget that funded the Shadow Network installations, which meant they had been paid for, in part, by some of the same people whose names were on the memorial wall. I thought about that as Rivi spoke. I thought about it throughout the session. I had been thinking about the memorial wall all morning. Before the session opened, I had walked its corridor alone, the full length, slowly, reading every name I passed, letting it take as long as it needed to take. At the far end, I stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a space that has been made significant by accumulated weight, and I said something I had been saving for a long time. I said, "We got there." The same number of words as the ones that had started this. 2. It seemed right. There were 68 member species present for the first session. 11 more were sending delegates who would arrive within the month. 22 additional applications were in active review, moving through the ratification process we had designed. 101 civilizations at various stages of joining a body that had not existed 8 weeks ago. 48 of them were current or former Concordat members. The Concordat still existed. I want to be very specific about this because some of the commentary in the galactic press, particularly in the weeks following the walkout and the Compact's establishment, had been dramatic in ways that misrepresented what was actually happening. The Concordat was not gone, and it was not dying, and it was not collapsing. It retained the membership of 200 species, with genuine, substantial, legitimate investments in its continued operation. Those were real interests, held by real civilizations, with real reasons to value the stability that a 4,000-year-old institution provides. What was over was the monopoly. 4,000 years during which the Concordat had been the only available framework for galactic governance, the only option for any civilization that wanted to participate in the organization of interstellar relationships. That was finished now. The galaxy had 2 frameworks. Whether more would eventually follow was a question I had no confident opinion about, but I thought the existence of 2 was already sufficient to change everything in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The session proceeded through its agenda with an efficiency that visibly surprised several of the newer member representatives, who had arrived expecting the disorganization typical of newly established institutions. What they found was a room full of people who had spent 31 years studying exactly how galactic governance worked and exactly where it failed, who had built the Compact's architecture specifically to address those failures. We were not discovering as we went. We had done the discovery earlier. We were implementing now. 17 species took the floor during open remarks. Most of the speeches were appropriately formal, calibrated for a significant moment that the speakers were not yet entirely certain how to characterize. 2 of them made me very still. The Polari delegate was a young official named Aidan Marsh, assigned to the role partly because the Concordat's Polari representation office had not paid sufficient attention to object to him. He was junior enough to have been overlooked. He stood and said, in a quiet voice that carried very clearly through the translation systems, that the Polari collective had joined the Terran Compact because for 4,000 years they had been members of a body that described itself as the representative of all civilization, and they had watched that body consistently represent the interests of its most powerful members at the expense of everyone else's. He said it without anger or bitterness or any kind of rhetorical performance. He said it the way someone states an observed fact they have been carefully verifying for a very long time and have finally been given permission to say out loud. The chamber was quiet when he finished. Not the silence of shock. The silence of recognition. The specific quiet of a room full of beings hearing something said aloud that they have been thinking privately for longer than they would like to admit. The second speech that stayed with me was from Yara, a delegate from the Vrthali Fourth Moon Regional Council. She had arrived at the Meridian, against the explicit instruction of the Vrthali hegemony government, and she said so at the beginning of her remarks, directly and without apology. She said her world had spent 60 years requesting greater representation in Concordat proceedings, and had been told, consistently and with procedural courtesy, that they were not yet ready for a larger voice. She said that when she read the Concordat's characterization of humanity as developmentally premature for integration, she recognized the language immediately, and with a clarity that was almost physical, because she had been reading the same language applied to her own world for 6 decades. She said she had come to the Meridian because she believed her world deserved to find out what ready actually felt like from the inside, rather than waiting indefinitely for permission from an authority that had never provided a definition of the word. The chamber was very quiet after Yara sat down. I looked around the room. 68 species, 68 entirely different forms and histories and needs and fears and hopes, 68 civilizations that had each, in their own particular way, experienced some version of being in a room where the significant decisions were happening somewhere else. When my turn came, I put aside the prepared remarks I had written and revised over the previous week. They were good, I thought, but they were too polished for what I actually wanted to say. What I wanted to say was shorter, and I thought more honest. I said, "We did not build this because we were angry. We built it because the galaxy is very large and belongs equally to everyone in it, and the structures that were supposed to reflect that truth had, over a very long time, stopped doing so. This body is not a condemnation of what came before. It is an addition, one more framework in a galaxy that deserves to have options, built on a single commitment that we have all agreed to, and that cannot be changed without the unanimous consent of everyone in this room. No one gets decided for. When that happens, we stop, we address it, then we continue. Everything else this body does follows from that one commitment. We will make mistakes. We will have disagreements and difficult sessions and decisions that look wrong in retrospect. That is the reality of any institution composed of real civilizations with real competing interests. What we will not have is a gallery." I looked at the room for a moment. "Welcome to the Meridian. Let us begin." The session ran for 6 hours. When it concluded and the hall began to empty into the hallway conversations where real relationships get started, Kara was waiting outside the main entrance with her device already in hand, and the expression she wore when her projections had been significantly exceeded. 11 more applications since we opened the session, she said. Just since the session opened. They were watching the feed. 29 relay networks carried it live. She paused before the next part. 4 of those networks are Concordat operated. They broadcast the session without waiting for authorization from the Communications Oversight Committee. I stood with that for a moment. 4 Concordat-operated relay networks had broadcast the founding session of an alternative to the Concordat, without waiting for Concordat approval to do so. Owen Price appeared to my left and handed me a cup of coffee. He had been running numbers and he told me what they showed. If the current application rate held, the compact would reach 100 member species within 14 months, giving it more members than the Concordat had at its 50th year of operation. The Concordat had a 4,000-year head start, I said. Yes, Owen said. I do not think that is going to matter. We walked to the memorial wall. Neither of us suggested it. We both simply moved in that direction, the way you move toward something that has been central to your thinking for a very long time, and that you need to return to when something significant has happened. The corridor was quiet. The station was alive with the margin conversations of the first session, the informal exchanges and introduction meetings and quiet relationship building that constitute most of the real work of any diplomatic institution. The formal session had concluded. The actual work of the compact, which would happen mostly in corridors and side rooms and quiet channels over months and years to come, had already started all around us. I walked the full length of the memorial corridor for the 4th time that day. Owen walked beside me in silence. The names were unchanged, as they would always be unchanged. But the weight of them was different now. Not lighter, different. Because the distance between what those 80,000 people had given and what had resulted from it was now a real, measurable thing, visible in a hall 60 meters away, where 68 civilizations were talking to each other without anyone deciding for them. At the end of the corridor, the small porthole showed the dark outside the station and the stars beyond the exterior lights. A message arrived on my device. I read the sender and read the message twice. It was from Advocate Cyril. The Concordat High Council has voted to send a formal observer delegation to the Terran Compact. Not a member delegation, an observer. He had added one line at the end, which was unusual for him, and which I thought he had thought carefully about including. I suspect you know how that feels. Owen read it over my shoulder. He made a sound somewhere between a short laugh and a long exhale. An observer, he said. An observer, I said. We stood at the porthole and did not say anything else for a while. The stars were there, the same ones that had been there through all of it, through every session in the observer gallery, and every planning meeting, and every relay station built in the dark, and every name added to the memorial wall, old and indifferent and very patient, burning without any interest in what civilizations did in the spaces between them. I thought about what Cyril had asked. What are you? I had answered it in writing, and every word of that answer was still true. But standing at the porthole in the corridor outside the memorial wall of the Meridian Station, on the day of the Terran Compact's inaugural session, I thought there was also a shorter answer underneath the longer one. We are a species that was told to wait. We built instead. We walked out when the moment was exactly right. We kept moving after. We do not stop. We have never stopped. In the main hall behind us, 68 civilizations were talking to each other in 68 different languages, without a gallery, without a presiding authority above them, without anyone deciding for any of them what they were allowed to say, or want, or build. The sound of it carried faintly down the corridor where I stood, complex and layered and alive, not polished by centuries of ceremony, not yet weighted by the accumulated precedent of a long history, new, real, moving forward in the way that new things move when the people building them understand what they are making. I thought about Yara of the Verthali Fourth Moon, sitting in that hall today with her application in process, about to find out what ready felt like from the inside. I thought about Aidan Marsh saying plainly that a body claiming to represent all civilization should actually do that. I thought about the 29 relay networks carrying the session live, and the 4 Concordat-operated ones that had not waited for permission, and the 11 applications received while the session was still running, and the Concordat High Council voting to send an observer to the thing they had spent 2 months trying to contain. I thought about the memorial wall, and the 80,000 names on it, and the fact that every single one of those names was connected to a dot on the deployment map that was now the foundation of something real. I thought, I hope they know. I thought, I think they do. There was a very great deal of work still left to do. There always would be, for a long time, because we had just started something that was going to take decades to build into what it had the potential to become. The applications would keep coming. The conversations would keep happening. The Concordat would send its observer, and eventually, probably, the observer would have thoughts about what they were observing. Species that had never interacted directly would find each other in the Meridian's corridors and begin the slow work of building relationships that did not pass through any intermediary's approval. All of that was in front of us. The memorial wall was behind me. The main hall was behind me. The stars were ahead. I finished my coffee. Owen finished his. We had calls to make and applications to process, and a galaxy that was watching from 1,000 different positions and forming its own views about what this meant and what came next. We went back to work. The stars were not going anywhere, and neither were we, and that, I had come to understand, was perhaps the most important thing about us, that the galaxy was only now beginning to properly account for. We do not stop. We did not stop. We will not stop. That is what we are.